welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello everyone, welcome back to Turn the Page. I am your host for today, Jen, and I am joined by a fantastic comics creator, graphic novelist, who is here to share a new edition of a really beautiful and frankly mind-blowing book. So let's get into it. Thank you for joining us. Welcome. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Hi, I'm Lucy Sullivan. I'm the creator of Barking, and I'm very flattered by that introduction. Thank you.
You're so welcome. Thank you for coming. And I'm wondering if we could start with just a little bit of a talk about your journey to the book. If you could talk a little bit about how it came to be from its first incarnation to this new edition as well.
Yeah, I mean it's a long story, but I'm in my 40s now. Gosh, towards the end of that. In my 20s, early 20s, my dad died quite suddenly. I was living abroad. I was living in New Zealand. I normally live in London. And I had a really traumatic sort of time getting home. He died of a brain aneurysm. It was really sudden and unexpected. He was only 54. He was really healthy. It was just like out of the blue. And coming home was really intense. And I left London because of the life being difficult here and gone to New Zealand to find a new life and new friends. And I was suddenly back with people I didn't want to be around and without my dad, who I was really, really close to. And it was rough. And about 18 months after, I had what I can only describe as like one of the worst nights of my life. I didn't actually remember it. It was that bad. I drank a lot and got in a lot of trouble. I grew up in a pub here, so I guess that's a bar, a public house. But here, they're owned by the breweries, and the families like live above who run it. So we lived above the pub. My parents ran the bar. So I was around people drinking, and I was around fights, and this was like it was a live music pub in the 70s. You know, it was quite an amazing but quite an intense upbringing. So when one of our doormen, who I'd known since I was a small child, told me that I had an anger problem, and what had happened that night that I couldn't remember, he said, you know, you've got to get some help. So I did. He's been in prison for his own consequences of his anger. So it was quite a major deal for him to tell me that I was angry. So you can probably get a hinting from that about just how bad things had gotten, actually. So it's funny to look back on it now, and I think when people are a lot more aware of kind of mental health problems and how it can come out, that now it would almost be like looking at self-harm or some of the things that I was doing. But at the time, people just thought I was a pain and I was difficult and unpleasant. And you know, people would be like, well, her dad died, but it was, you know, it was nearly 2 years ago. Why is she still so upset? And it was sort of like, it was really, really hard to get sympathy. Anyway, I got help. Part of that was doing cognitive behavioral therapy. That worked really well for me. And out of that came a reminder of how much I loved drawing and how important that was for me. So I went to university. I got a degree in illustration and animation. And I started off as an animation director. My work was too creepy for modern animation standards, especially in the UK, where at the time everyone wanted things to be quite cute. And if I try and draw something cute, it looks like it's trying to kill you. So it's best left to other people. But I moved into comics after having my daughter and just started working on the story. I was sort of getting depression again, and you know, I had this idea for a story that I wasn't sure if it was going to be an animation or a comic or what, but that would be a way of depicting what I'd been through, talking about depression and using kind of symbolism to talk about the black dog, but also talk about other forms of depression that aren't usually depicted. I think often we're so used to seeing the idea of someone sort of closed up in their house and head in their hands and really afraid of the world and not wanting to go out. And I was nothing like that. I was out all the time. I had 3 jobs, I was very competent, but I just had a habit of getting drunk and picking fights with people, and it was not a it was not a great way to be. You have to excuse me, I get nervous laughter about it because it's one of those, it's so embarrassing still, and it's still such an incredibly difficult thing to look back on. And even after putting it in the book, it's still, yeah, it's still quite an intense experience. So yeah, I probably spent about 10 years developing it on and off, from like early beginning to actually getting a publisher and getting it out in the world. The first edition came out with a publisher called Unbound, who are a crowdfunding publisher. They don't actually do comics anymore. I think I was a kind of death nail for that. They are a literary publisher, and they realized they maybe bit off a little more than they could chew when it came to creating books for comic books. So yeah, I sold out the first print run in the first year, which is 1.5 thousand books in the UK, and this was during the pandemic. So I did all the publicity and sold them pretty much all myself. So I was really, really thrilled that people could be interested in it when it's a book about incarceration, essentially, and we were all locked in our houses and having a really difficult time. And then I sort of decided that I needed to leave the publisher because we weren't on the same page, and it was such a sort of long process to get the book out, and started trying to find another publisher. And I love Avery Hill. You probably can't even see half my library. Like,
Oh yeah.
only you'll be able to see it, Jen. But I've got a lot of comics, and there's more here above my head that you can't see. And I'd say, a very serious chunk of them are Avery Hill books. So I just thought I'd just ask in case they were interested, and they were. So we have the second edition now coming out this month, which is incredibly exciting.
Wow. Yeah, it is very exciting. And it's such a long journey for this book, and you've lived with it for a really long time. It's an incredibly, as you've hinted so far, it's a very vulnerable work, and it's really a very stark look, both at, I think, like what the personal experience of, the healthcare system is, and being in an enclosed environment in that healthcare system, and like the systemic things that sort of like contribute to how that might not be a really great place to heal all the time. And so that's a long, rambly way of asking, could you talk a little bit about the art style and maybe how it speaks to like these themes that you're exploring, because it's so expressive and it's unlike a lot of comics I've ever seen before, and I really love the style.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate it. I spent a lot of time trying to develop the look. It was really tricky I think, because I wanted to get across the terror of losing your kind of footing in reality, and how scary that is, and how hard it can be if you're difficult with that to get sympathy and to get aid. It couldn't be, rendered in watercolor, and it couldn't be a gentle pencil. And these are all things I enjoy. I also, although I knew that it had to be black and white just to get across, I think it's such an easy language for depression. I really, on a purely artistic level, I really enjoy playing with negative space and like using the page. And I think coming from animation, where you're so stuck with a rectangle and you've really got to find a way to like make it an interesting visual thing, you sort of really learn to use the space you're not using and how important that is as much as what you're putting on screen. And then having a page where you're like, well, actually a double page spread is just another rectangle. I've just got to think about this line down the middle. And I've read comics my whole life, so I knew the language of it, but finding that way that I wanted to do it was a really, really long process. And I'm lucky that at the time when I started developing it, I got lucky that when I started developing it, I was teaching life drawing. And one of my students was Nika Badzis, who did a book called Laika about the dog that got sent to space. It won the Eisner. It's just an astonishing, beautiful, heartbreaking book, especially for dog lovers. But he looked over what I was doing. I showed him how I was making it, and he was just like, "This is a crazy way to make a comic." I'm like, I know, but it's the only way I can do it. And essentially, I think because I wanted it to feel personal, and I found it really hard to draw myself doing the things I actually did. So I invented a character, and I have this character, Alix Otto, that sort of goes through what I went through. Whilst I was developing it, I had friends who were sectioned, and I wasn't. I was really lucky that I got. So section obviously means to be put in a mental health ward. Here it would be on the National Health Service. I got private care. I went, I paid for a doctor myself. But watching them and seeing what they went through, I had to think about, well, how would I have fared if all of that happened and I had to go through the National Health Service? And I think it would have exacerbated everything. And I think everything would have gone incredibly bad for me under those circumstances. So I wanted to talk about that as well. So getting all of those involved with the art style was really, really, really tricky. But eventually I just sort of stuck to what I know. So I knew as a hand-drawn animator how to make quite kinetic poses. I wanted it to feel like it really kind of rambled, like quickly moved you quite quickly through it, quite a frantic pace, so that you would feel that kind of descent and feel that kind of sudden push into another world and how that can just stop. I knew that I wanted Alix's depression to be this black dog, and I knew that I wanted it to be always attached to her via her shadow. So I needed a way of getting this kind of black streak, But I also knew that if I wanted it to have the immediacy of feeling, that if I was penciling and then inking and then it's just going to lose it. So I was teaching life drawing and drawing with biros, and I thought, I really, so biro, we call that here. I don't know if you just call them like pens, maybe, but we call them biros here, which I think is just a make of pen, but like a ballpoint pen, basically, if that makes sense. I always remember it's such an English thing to call it a biro, but a ballpoint pen. So it's got, the ink inside, and you have the little ball, and you get that kind of smudging as the ink kind of builds up on it. And I was like, oh, that could, if I, so it was all built out of things like that. I used carbon typewriter sheets, which you can see, but maybe no one else can. So these are like black pieces of paper that we used to put onto typewriters, and you'd get a depression as you typed. And I use dip pens and my nails and anything I can to just kind of get that across. So yeah, it was sort of developed out of all of these different aspects, drawn really loosely on animation paper, because it's very, very smooth. And I had a load of it for free, which made it even better option. And then put together on Photoshop. So really, I think having the loose way of sketching and then being able to put it onto Photoshop and then consider what I'd drawn and how that could lay out. And each page is designed individually. So each double page spread, which is probably why it looks so unusual. I don't follow any of the kind of 9-panel grids or any of the rules of comics. So sorry, aficionados. Like, if you love Kirby, you're going to find this challenging. But bear with it. I still respect a lot of rules of page turns and paginations, but yeah, I really went through it. I just thought, if it's the only book I ever make, I'm just gonna make the book that I want to make and see if there's an audience for it. And I wasn't sure there would be, but I've been really delighted that actually there is. So yeah.
It was a great answer. Thank you. And it's, it does combine this sort of like feeling a little, as you say, uncontrolled, while also feeling precise in some other ways. I don't know if that quite makes sense, but it does so in a way that like really captures Alix's subjective experience, that sort of like untethered floating from experience to experience while you're really disoriented. Yeah, was it challenging, to sort of like structure the narrative when you are playing with such a loose kind of structure?
Yeah, yeah, it really was. And I think it's one of those kind of can of worms that you go, I'm going to do it and it's going to be about my experience, but I also want it to be about this. And then I did uncover research and you're like, oh gosh, this just gets bigger and bigger. And, and I really had to go, okay, I've got to find a way to kind of limit what I'm saying. And I'm just going to have to be picky. There's so much to talk about, but I can't discuss everything and I can't discuss everyone's experience. So what I ended up doing was not overwriting a script. I set it into kind of chapters, and I realized that I was getting around a kind of 10 chapter feel to it. And then I thought, okay, well, if I limit that to 10 pages, then I'm looking at 100 odd pages. So, I think I go slightly over in a couple of chapters, but, we won't talk about that. But it just limited how many pages I had to say something. So then I had to really start thinking of like how I got to that crux point. So I would write each chapter as a scene, so more like a film script. So it'd be a bit of kind of action, some of the dialogue, but nothing too structured. So that when I hit the drawing board, because especially at that point, I think I was much more confident as an artist than a writer, and I knew that I could visually represent something so much more interestingly and uh, empathetically than I could write it at that stage. And I wanted it to not be a very verbose kind of comic. I didn't want a lot of language because I think a lot of it is internal. It's not about what she's saying or what people are saying to her. It's about really what the black dog's saying to her and another a thing that turns up in the book. And these are all parts of her, and it's her internal dialogue that I really wanted to get across, and that should be fractured and disjointed and confusing to her and the reader. So yeah, it has some structure, but it's very, very loose. And then it was just a matter of defining it in those pages and then yeah, being very much like, okay, I'm doing this chapter, I'm going to focus. So it was done at a time, and then I could really get involved in what that chapter was about and then move on, sort of thing. So it was like I said, it was a terrible way to make a comic. It was absolutely not time economic or any of those things, but I learned so much doing it that I wouldn't change going through that process, but I'm certainly not repeating it anytime soon. I write much more concise scripts now and I plan to a much greater level, definitely.
Wow, that's so interesting because, it really does seem as though, her sometimes like outer silence is not like a sort of understimulated one. It's like almost overstimulated, like a bursting at the seams with like so many voices that like one can't quite get through. And I really love just the way that like the environment like expresses her inner fragmentation so much as well. Can you talk about populating the rest of the institution that Alix finds herself in, because it's full of people who are, in the same position as her, and then also the people who are watching over her and her fellow patients. Can you talk about like, yeah, filling out this cast and maybe, what characters were important for conveying the message of the book, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think so. I had people from my own life that I was very keen to portray. I found a couple of people that were incredibly sympathetic. So the doorman, Al, who told me I had a problem. I had another, actually, a lot of them were doormen, which is security guards, which is one of those things. But I think something that was very keen about that. So Al's from Jamaican heritage. Another friend, Anelli, is Fijian. They're all people who have presumptions made about them on their appearance. And I found this research that said that if you were a black man, a person of color, or a young woman under 20, you were 5 times more likely to be physically restrained and sedated in a mental health ward in the UK. And I just thought that was just an astonishing statistic. And possibly, if I thought about myself at the time and I was very, very prickly and very aggressive and very confrontational, if someone tried to manhandle me, I mean, I'd have kicked off and it would have just got very, very bad, you know, so I would have probably been sedated on a regular basis. And obviously that's a very humiliating experience, on top of people putting you on a bed and pulling your trousers down and injecting you. And, you know, it's a really horrible thing to happen. It's also obviously going to be really triggering if you've had any form of sexual assault or abuse. And I was sexually assaulted during my breakdown. And, you know, it just, all of these things that you suddenly go, blimey, you know, I can't believe that I went through that. And actually, I was so lucky that I didn't get help in the end, you know, and it's all stuff I wanted to talk about. So I knew I had to populate these people in a way that was sympathetic to the people who had helped me. So one of the nurses who helps Alix in the book, Baz Barrington, you know, made a point of making him a person of color, because I felt like, you know, for me, those were the people who were actually the most sympathetic and who had the most understanding and the most interesting ways to talk about grief. You know, my friend Anelli would talk to me about how they honor the dead in Fiji and how it takes months, and you know, you get this like forever kind of understanding that obviously you're going to find it difficult sometimes because you've lost your loved one. Whereas I feel like, especially British culture, we're expected to get over it within a week and just get on with stuff. And you know, my dad was London Irish, and you know, we had a night for him, but we didn't get a wake. And you suddenly realize how important these things are to help you recover. So you know, I really wanted to depict all of that, but then I also wanted to depict the sort of casual nature of, you know, I think the NHS here is an amazing institution, and I think nurses are incredible, but we get a lot of kind of agency nurses who don't care particularly about the work. They come and go. Also, people who bring their own ideas about madness. You know, you get some staff who, perhaps for religious reasons or cultural reasons, don't actually believe in mental health problems. They think it's another thing. I have a friend who was sectioned, and one of the nurses told her that she was possessed by the devil. She wasn't actually mentally ill, you know. So it was trying to get all of that across. And I watched a lot of kind of reference films, particularly, I don't know if you've ever heard of The Singing Detective, which was an early Michael Gambon. That was very influential on me, and I love that kind of surreal depiction as his mind is affected and everything that turns into a musical. And you know, I really wanted to go down that kind of path. And he had the nurses' outfits are wonderful. They have these kind of puffy shoulders and little kind of caps. And, you know, nurses don't look like that, especially in the time that I drew, which was the 90s. It was very unpleasant, unflattering outfits. So I thought, I'm just going to dress them all up in like in, you know, a Michael Gambon TV show. So the considerations like that, and obviously like the Nurse Ratchet character, you know, you've got to have that kind of formidable, and I wanted her to be like kind of young and just like, yeah, whatever, like I'm busy, get on with yourself, I've got stuff to do kind of thing. Because I think there's a lot of that, and you're suddenly just a pain, and you become the room number and the diagnosis, and you're just this pain in someone's everyday life. So it was finding those characters was really important, and then finding people, yeah, to populate the hospital that could be sympathetic to Alix and offer her a way out, because there are always people that are sympathetic. And I found some really great friendships out of that tragedy, so I sort of just had to put those people via, and I don't know if everyone will recognize themselves in the characters, but yeah, hopefully they might if they read it. You know, I don't know that half the people I know even read comics, but you know, it's there as a thank you.
Mm. Yeah, that's a really lovely way, I think, to, yeah, just honor the experiences of all the people, your friends and the people that you spoke to along this journey. And something that, you know, I think like for me, what really hit home about, um, you know, the environment that you are in when you are sectioned, and it's, you know, it's not all that different here either, that you know, at a moment when you are feeling so vulnerable and so powerless, like all that really happens to you is like more power is taken away, you know. And it's just like that helplessness is very visceral when you're reading, and I think it's like a very very sobering and very helpful experience for folks who want to understand like why our healing institutions might not really be, doing all that much healing. So thank you for the
Yeah,
story. It's really
I'm really glad that comes across because it's such a, when you look at it, it's such a bizarre way to treat someone who is vulnerable and in need of a comfort, to just lock them in a room. And it's a literal sweep under the carpet. And I think, especially in the UK, when you consider that for us, mental health care comes out of being built on bedlam and being encouraged. People were encouraged to come and laugh at the ill people and look at these freaks, and it's sort of like improved upon bedlam. And instead, we should just be like raising it to the ground and starting again. And I think so many diagnoses and theories were built out of men making their name as famous kind of psychiatrists. And I've found out about how Freud used to take sort of basically psychotropics and run around his garden. Not Freud, Jung would run around his garden like naked, and you just think, wow, I can sit in the modern world and be diagnosed on a guy who got high in his in his nude ways and came up with some theory. It's like, wow, I have theories, but I'm not gonna take someone's liberty away at the root of that, right? And it's a really, the minute you stop and think about it, and you think about what if it was me, how would I feel? And I think, and you see it that way, you just go, this is just a really unusual way to approach a problem, and to approach, like you said, healing. There's nothing healing about a mental health ward. They're terrifying places. And another friend who was sectioned, her ward, you'd look out the window and you could see the Houses of Parliaments in the UK. So it's on the Thames. So a lot of this takes place there. You could look out and there would be cockroaches going across your window sill. You're right up high. And there's, Parliament, its glory, and their free bar, and their, wonderful dinners that they have. And you just think, this is just ridiculous, So I really wanted to get that across, and I'm really glad it comes across, because I can't imagine anything worse than being that terrified and someone also then, isolating you, taking away your liberty, and just making you feel even more vulnerable. And I think that's absolutely the worst we can do. But, hopefully the pandemic has made us more aware of what it means to have someone take away your liberty, and how frustrating that is, and how difficult that is. So, I think in many ways, although it was hard to launch Barking during a pandemic, it might have aided people in like taking that story on board. They might have thought it was a bit fanciful before that, and now they know it's not.
Oh my gosh, yes, absolutely. Yeah, that timing is so interesting too. And I think it's a very timely story for lots of other reasons too. And, thank you for coming to our show and talking about this book with us. I'm very excited to share it with our readers here.
Oh, thank you. I'm so excited for it to be out in North America. It's like a dream come true. So I really appreciate it. And thanks for inviting me on.
Oh, you're so welcome. Okay, listeners, it's your turn. You're going to pick up Barking. By the time that you hear this episode, it will be out in the world. So please go to your favorite library or independent bookstore or comic book store, wherever you like to go for those sorts of things. Thanks so much for joining us. It is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.